Welcome back, friends. In today's tutorial, you're going to learn how to do pagination in GraphQL. If you're new around here, my name is Dan Vega, and I'm a Spring Developer Advocate at VMware Tanzu. I also run the website danvega.dev. If you want to learn more about me, this is probably the best place to do so. There is a whole bunch of information on here. There's also a lot of free content for you. My blog, I have a ton of articles and videos and courses. I also have a newsletter that I drop every other Monday, and this just gives you an insight into the things that I'm working on or things that I found interesting around the web. Also, there's a speaking tab up here. If you want to see where I am speaking next, go ahead and click there. What we are talking about today, though, is GraphQL. So I've got a couple of articles and videos that I've created lately, and this is really going to be the culmination of those and kind of building on those. So what we're talking about is pagination in GraphQL. So I want to start with the article that I wrote, GraphQL Spring Boot up and running with Spring for GraphQL. If we take a look at this down here in the what section, this is a really great article. There's a video that's going to accompany that. So if you're interested, check that out first. What I mentioned in here is that GraphQL isn't tied to any specific database or storage engine. Instead, it's backed by your existing code and data. This is a really important concept to understand. The same way that your REST APIs aren't tied to a specific database or storage engine, right? When you create a REST API, you have a REST controller, and when you need some data, you delegate that off to a service or a repository. The same is going to be said about GraphQL. So when you're asking questions like, how does GraphQL connect to my database? How does GraphQL do paging? Those are kind of the wrong questions to ask. We're going to delegate that off to a service or a repository, and instead we'll take a look at the GraphQL specific bits on how to get arguments in and then pass those off to the data layer. So again, if you're new to GraphQL, this is a good article to check out. The other portion of this is Spring Data JPA pagination. I have an article and video on this, and this is where you really want to start because we aren't going to do these bits in this particular tutorial. We're going to focus in on the GraphQL pagination side of things. So what this article and video does is walk you through setting up a new project, how you can include Spring Data JPA, how you can use the paging and sorting repository. Again, GraphQL doesn't care about this bit. If this bit is in place, we can go ahead and add the GraphQL specific code and just tie into the existing data infrastructure that we already have. So that's going to be our starting point. And the way that we're going to do that is if you head over to the repo, this repository will be in the description below. It's also in that article on Spring Data JPA pagination. The master branch on this has kind of the finished code. But if you head over to the GraphQL paging starter branch, that is what we are going to work from today. So if you want to kind of code along with me, that's the branch that you want to use, and we can use that as a starting point, which includes all of the data stuff. We'll review this quickly, but that is where we want to start. So the way that we are going to do this is let's go ahead and bring up a terminal here. I'm going to go ahead and clone this. So let's copy this. We'll go ahead and git clone. We're going to move into that directory. So GraphQL paging. We're going to go ahead and open this up in IntelliJ IDEA. You can open this up in whatever editor, text editor, IDE you want. I happen to love IntelliJ, so I'm going to use that. And we'll go ahead and let this get loaded. And what I'll do is I'll actually take my face off the screen. We'll give it some more screen real estate for us to go through some code. And we'll start by just kind of going through the starting code here. And so you get an idea of what we're starting with. And then we'll go ahead and add the GraphQL bits in. All right, so now that I have this application open up in my IDE, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the starter branch, GraphQL-paging-starter. And I'm going to check that out. This gives us a starting point that we can kind of work with together. So nothing special going on in the main application class. We have some data, some sample data being loaded. This is implementing a command line runner, so this will start after the application context is loaded and before the run command is run. We have this run method here, and this will create 100 rows in our database. So we're using that faker library to create some really nice sample data in our database. We save all those using our repository. So we have a model of a person and an address. These are entities. These are mapped to a table. So we have a person table and an address table. And there's a person repository that extends the paging and sorting repository, which we'll get to here in a second. So we currently have an existing controller in there for a person controller, which is a REST controller mapping to /API/people. And I wanted to keep this in there because I wanted to kind of show the similarities between this controller and the GraphQL controller. So with that, we understand what the basics of this application is doing. Again, I want to keep stressing this as we go through these tutorials that GraphQL does not care about your data. It is independent of your data. It doesn't connect to a database. The GraphQL controller is going to delegate that to a service or a repository. All right, so the first thing that we got to do on the GraphQL side is set up the schema. So to do so, I'm going to go ahead and create a new directory here called GraphQL. In that directory, I'm going to create a new file called schema.graphqls. And here's where we're going to go ahead and set up our schema. So again, if you're new to this, I've created a video on kind of getting started with Spring for GraphQL, where we talked about, creating the schema and talking about object types and top level operations. So let's get right into that in this one. I'm going to start with my object types, and these are going to kind of mimic what I have in this model folder here. So we're going to start with a type of person, and a person is going to have an ID. They're going to have a first name, which is going to be of type string. They're going to have a last name, which is of type string. They're going to have a phone number, which is of type string. We'll also have an email, which is of type string. And then they'll have an address, which is of type address. So it's going to complain because we haven't set up address yet. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to have an ID, address, city, state, and zip. Okay, so those are our basic object types. And again, they're kind of mapping up to this. So if we, I can't open that side by side. There we go. So if we look at person, we have things like an ID, first name, last name, phone number, and email, as well as an address. So this is what we're saying is in our schema. These are the fields that are available on the API. So the first thing I'm going to do now is go ahead and set up, these are our root operation types. And so we're going to set up a query so we can read data. And the first one we're going to do is just return all people. And this is going to return a collection of persons. So let's do this one before we get into some of the paging. So I'm going to create a new controller here. And let's call this person GraphQL controller. All right, the first thing we do here in our controller is we map it with @controller. We're going to need some data. So to get some data, we're going to get an instance of our person repository. So to do that, I'm going to say private final person repository, and we're going to add a constructor parameter. So Spring can go ahead and auto-wire that instance in for us using constructor injection. So now we're going to need a method that returns all people. Let's look at the person repository real quick. This is extending the paging and sorting repository, which extends the CRUD repository. So we get a method in here called findAll. This does return an iterable of type T here. In our case, that's a person. So this is going to return an iterable of person. And we'll go ahead and call this all people. We're going to return person repository.findAll. And that's all there is to it. Now we need to map this method to the method in our schema that we created, right? So the way that we do that is we can use, if this name and this name is the same, it sure is, we can go ahead and use the query mapping annotation. And that should be all we need to get all of the people in the database. One more thing I'm going to do is in application.properties, I've enabled, so this is already enabled for you if you're following along, but you want to enable graphical so you can kind of test out your queries. With that, we have everything we need to go ahead and run this application, head over to the browser and visit our graphical UI. All right, so here I am in GrapphQL and I click on query and we see that we have an all people query that returns a collection of persons. So what I want to do is just go ahead and say query all people, and I just want the first name, last name, phone number, and email. Well, let's just grab everything. So address, city, state, zip. Oh, I must have spelled that wrong, but I'll leave it there for now. So let's go ahead and run this. And as you see, we get all of that information back. So far, so good. Let's head back over to our application and let's take a look at address. In the schema, I must have spelled it wrong, and I did. So we'll go ahead and refresh that, restart our application. And let's just change this before we move forward, and everything is okay. So now that we have that working, we want to talk about pagination. So again, there are two sides to this. First, we have to define something in our schema, and then we have to go ahead and define a method and map that method to the schema. So here in our schema, let's just create a new method. We'll call it all people paged. And all people paged is going to take two arguments, the first of which is called page, and that is going to be of type int. And then we'll go ahead and take size, which is of type int. So the size is the number of records per page. So let's say we want to display 10 records per page. The page is the page that we're on. So on page 0, you would get the records 1 through 10. On page 1, you'd get the records 11 through 20, and so on. So this has still got to define what it's going to return. It's still going to return a collection of person. So now back in our GraphQL controller, let's go ahead and do this. Now, actually, I want to head over to the person controller. We have this in a in a REST controller. And we have this method here that is public page of person find all. It takes a page, a size, and it does something and returns it all. If you want to compare the two when we're done, they're pretty similar. It's pretty similar to what we would do in a REST controller endpoint. So before we do this, I do want to jump back into that person repository and we look at the paging and sorting repository. So this is giving us that paging and sorting. We have two new methods in here, and these are the ones I want to look at. So the first one is find all, which takes a sort. That's not the one we're really interested in. This one, though, find all, takes a pageable and returns a page of T. So if we look at pageable, pageable is actually an interface. We need an implementation of this interface to work with. In Spring, there is one. It's called page request. So if you look at page request, this extends abstract page request, which also implements pageable. So this is exactly what we're looking for. Page request has a couple of really nice static methods. So these are overloaded. They're called of. The first one takes an int page and an int size. And this is exactly what we are looking for. So if we can create an instance of this page request with this static of method, we can use this to pass into that findAll method that takes a type of pageable. So that's what we're going to do. So here in our GraphQL controller, we're going to say public page of person, and we're going to call this all people paged. Remember, that's what we named it in our schema. We are going to have an int page and an int size. Now, let's just kind of return null for now. Now remember, on the GraphQL side, if you want to map an argument from the a named argument from GraphQL to our arguments here, we can use the @argument annotation. So we'll do that for this. We'll do that for this, and we are good to go there. So now, before we can call that findAll method on the paging and sorting repository, we need to create an instance of that page request. So we'll say page request.of, and you can see the different overloaded methods here. The first one just takes a page and a size, and we have those in the arguments, so we can go ahead and get those from there. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and call our person repository.findAll, the one that takes a pageable, and PR is of type pageable, so that will work. So now if we just go ahead and add this query mapping, this will go ahead and map this method to our schema. So when GraphQL tries to execute this query, it knows on the Spring side this is what it's going to call. So let's go ahead and just rerun this application. And let's just change this to all people. I got to refresh this. So let's change this to all people paged. Now, all people paged is going to take a couple of parameters. The first is the page. We'll say 0. The size, we'll say 2. This means we want 2 records per page. So if we go ahead and run this, you see that we get 2 records here. And you can see the first name and the last name for these two. We'll watch that change as we change the page and so on. All right, so what I want to take a look at here is the return type, this page of person. We're actually just on the GraphQL side getting back the data. All people paged, we have an array of objects. Those objects are person objects, and that's what we get back. So we are getting back exactly what we asked for. Page 2 with 2 records on this page. But there is actually a lot of more helpful information in this page. So if we look at page, public interface page, extend slice. So from that page, you can get a whole bunch of information like total pages, total elements. You can get the actual page, which we can do some other things with. Slice actually includes some things like number, size, number of elements. The content is what we want back, whether it's sort. These are very helpful. Is first, is last, has next, has previous. You can imagine on a UI where you're trying to paginate through these records, and maybe you have a next and previous button. If you had this information in there, if it was is first, it returns true. Then on the first page, you would either disable or not even show the previous button, right? If it's the last page, if this returns true, you would disable the next button or not even show it. So there are a lot of helpful things that you can return to the client. Now, this really just depends on what the client is trying to display. In this case, we don't have a UI set up for it. It's just two arguments that we want to pass to our GraphQL controller to control the outcome and not display all of the records at once. So this really is up to you. I want to work on another demo that kind of shows the kind of power of all of this stuff you can return. But I'm really curious to see what you guys are doing with this. So please, if you're having trouble kind of putting together a little bit more complex return types, let me know and I'll put something together on that. So I think with that, that's kind of where we'll leave it. Again, the final source code for this is in Dan Vega GraphQL-paging. There is a starter in here if you want to kind of build this on your own. But again, I just wanted to kind of stress today that what I've been stressing is that GraphQL is independent of your data layer. So when you ask like how can I do paging in GraphQL, it doesn't really matter. To GraphQL, it doesn't care. We're delegating that responsibility, in this case, to a Spring Data JPA repository. But I just want to make sure we are clear on that. So, hey, if this tutorial has helped you out, please go ahead and leave me a thumbs up, click that subscribe button, and as always, friends, happy coding.